You have a quiz, so let's study for our quiz. True or false? Slaves received a percentage of the profit from the crops they grew on the plantation. True or false? False. Slaves were considered property. Slaves were considered property, similar to a horse. True. Because slaves were an investment, they were treated with great dignity. True or false? False. Slaves could come and go as they pleased. True or false? False. True or false? Whipping was fairly common. True. Families were kept together. Just talking about families of slaves were kept together. True or false? False. Most slaves did not live a long time. True. Families were often broken up. True or false? Families of slaves it's talking about. True. At what age did the slaves begin to work full-time in the fields? 12. True or false? Slaves lived in a one-room shack. True. The rooms that slaves lived in had cheap wooden floors. False. 6 to 8 slaves lived together. True. Slaves were allowed to tend small gardens. True. Slaves had plenty to eat except in the winter. False. In which part of the South were slaves treated the worst? The Deep South. When addressing the owner, it was expected the slave would what? Bow his head and look at his feet. What could slaves do on Sunday? They could tend their gardens, and they could sing, dance, and worship. Could a slave be punished for trying to escape? Yes, they could. Could a slave be punished for showing disrespect? Yes, they could. Could a slave be punished for preparing food the wrong way? Yes. Could a slave be punished for having funerals after dark? No. Why was the Dred Scott decision so controversial in the North? Because slaves were looked on as property and they had no rights. I'm going to read this. I want you to tell me if this was an argument that the Southerners used to defend the institution of slavery. Did the Southerners say the Bible advocated and accepted slavery? Yes, they did. Did the South say that slaves were inferior? Yes, they did. Did the South say the founders were unanimous in supporting it? No, they didn't. Did the South say the Constitution seemed to support slavery? Yes, they did. Why was slavery not as important in the North as it was in the South? Okay, immigrant labor was available, and slavery would be less profitable in the North. Which one event led to a rapid increase in the number of slaves in the South? The invention of the cotton gin. Let's see. I'm going to read this. I want you to tell me if this is a characteristic of the North or the South. Poor transportation. The South. Heavy industry. The North. Cultural melting pot. The North. Slavery. The South. Many immigrants. The North. Almost no cities over 100,000 in population. The South. Small farms. The North. Few railroads. The South. Large plantations. The South. Heavy industry. The North. Nearly half the population were slaves. The South. Many immigrants. The North. Cultural melting pot. The North. Which one was predominantly Catholic? The South. What type of society was the South? Agrarian. That means it was mostly agriculture. Which type of society was the North? Industrial. I'm going to say a definition. I want you to tell me which vocabulary word I'm talking about. A society based around agriculture rather than industry. Agrarian. Characteristics of the population, such as size, density, and distribution. Demographics. People of the highest social class or nobility. Aristocracy. A tax on imported goods. Tariff. A crop grown to be sold at market rather than used for livestock feed or personal use. Cash crop. When addressing the owner, it was expected that a slave would do what? Bow their heads and look at their feet. True or false? Concerning the life of a slave. Slaves were part owners and received a percent of the profit from the crops they grew. True or false? False. Slaves were considered property, similar to a horse. True. Because slaves were an investment, they were treated with great dignity. True or false? False. The North believed the federal government needed to provide more control over its citizens. True or false? True. Why were there few transportation innovations in the South compared to the North? Because the rivers provided all the transportation needs of the plantation and farm owners. The conflict between regions that finally became the Civil War began to come to a head during what decade? the 1850s. True or false? The Civil War resulted almost overnight from rapid growth and change throughout the United States. False. The Civil War happened primarily because of the South's dependence on slave labor. False. True or false? The root causes of the Civil War began in the very early history of the United States and developed over time. True. Name 3 things that a slave could be punished for. Trying to escape, showing disrespect, and preparing food in the wrong way. What could the slaves do on Sunday? They could tend their gardens, they could go to church, and they could sing, praise, and worship. Okay, if you had problems on any of that, I want you to go and review it. Make sure you know it before you take your quiz.